When scaling an organization to become a mid-size or large organization, there's a lot of inflection points and pain points that you go through along the way. A lot of mini transformations you need to go through. So what I want to talk about today is how do organizations scale from startup to $1 billion in revenue, and what are some of those growth and scaling points of inflection that they need to go through. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And most of our clients are in the mid-market. They're high-growth companies that are growing organically and or through M&A activity. They, at one point, were a startup that had zero in revenue, and they're on the quest to become $1 billion or even more than $1 billion in revenue. So what I want to talk about today are some of those inflection points and ceilings that organizations hit along the way as they go through their transformation journeys. Now, the first phase of any organization's life cycle is the startup phase. And they're over here at zero. They've got a great idea, great concept. They have an initial team in place. They hit the market and they start growing the company. So you've got this startup phase, and oftentimes you have organizations that go through significant growth along the way. They have early wins, early successes, early wins. And oftentimes what these organizations are struggling with is establishing some initial business processes, establishing an initial team, and getting some early preliminary technologies in place to help automate their business. And usually, those technologies are more focused on the sales and financial management aspect of the business. So these organizations earlier in their cycle are more likely to leverage CRM technologies, for example, to automate their sales processes. They're also more likely to leverage marketing automation to really grow the market and fuel demand for their products or services. And they're also more likely to implement QuickBooks or some other accounting software to really manage the basic financial and accounting aspects of their business. So this is that startup phase that organizations go through. And as is the case with this and the four phases that I'm going to talk about here today, the duration that each organization spends in each of these phases really varies. It depends on how fast they're growing, how scalable their business model is, and what some of the challenges are they face along the way. But in general, this is the first phase. And at some point in this startup phase, they reach a breaking point. They reach a ceiling of where they can't move above this point because they've got scalability issues. And so they need to figure out a way to move from the startup phase to the next phase, and that's what I'll talk about next. So once an organization hits this ceiling, they reach this point here where they just can't bust past this phase because they can't scale. And oftentimes it's related to operations. Their operations won't scale. So if it's a manufacturing organization, they can't seem to scale up their production fast enough to keep up with demand. If it's a services organization, they can't hire enough good people and manage enough good processes to manage those services. Whatever the case may be, there's something holding back the organization from breaking through to the next phase. So what they need to do is figure out, how do we break through this phase so that we can get to this phase of initial scale? And this is where we really start to scale the operations of the business. Here we are in startup mode. We're focused on just getting some basic processes in place, driving sales, driving marketing, driving some initial revenue and accounting. Here we start to focus on how do we really leverage and scale our operations. So a manufacturing organization at this point might start to look at what are some manufacturing execution systems that we can implement and deploy to help us scale to this next level. If it's a distribution organization, they might be thinking about how can we put in a warehouse management system that will help us scale for this growth. And it really depends on what your business is, what product or service you're offering, but most organizations find ways through technology improvements, business process improvements, and organizational improvements to help ensure that they reach this next phase of success. Now, one thing I'll also mention is as you move out of startup into this initial scale phase of the project, what you end up finding is now you're moving from this sort of gunslinging startup approach to more of a mature or maturing organization where you need to start thinking less about gunslinging and a little bit more about repeatable processes. And that's where a lot of companies get stuck and they don't get past this phase because they culturally can't make that shift. So in addition to that culture, you also have to look at the business processes and the technologies that enable you or allow you to get to here. But even in this phase, in this initial scalability or initial scaling phase, you inevitably will reach another sticking point or another ceiling that you need to move past, and that's what I'll talk about next. Now, once organizations have scaled up their operations, Then what typically happens is they find that they're not as efficient as they could be. They put a bunch of Band-Aids in place over here. They might have thrown in some process improvements or new technologies to help automate their warehouse or their manufacturing shop floor. But now what they find is they've got a bunch of disparate systems that they put in as sort of a patchwork or Band-Aid spaghetti approach to automating some of their processes. Now they're trying to mature and really get to that next level of scale. They're trying for repeatable, consistent processes. They're trying to drive cost efficiencies. And generally, the growth rate is starting to slow down at this point. So in other words, for example, you might have been doubling or tripling in size here. Growth starts to slow down a bit here, but still pretty steady and aggressive, maybe 20, 30%. And then you get to this maturity level where you start to see your revenue drop off or level off, where you're a more mature organization that's penetrated the market, and now you start to look at ways you can optimize cost. So when organizations are here, in order to keep scaling and keep growing, they've got to figure out how can we get to that next level of scale that focuses more on mature technologies, mature business processes. So this is where you'd consider more of like an ERP system, enterprise resource planning system, to automate and tie together your entire operations, to replace this hodgepodge of systems you might have grown the organization with down here. Now you're looking for more mature technologies that are more established, that are more focused on repeatable processes and standardization and whatnot. And so that oftentimes is what fuels this third stage or next phase of growth. But again, inevitably, these organizations end up tapping out, or they reach a ceiling up here, and there's another ceiling that they hit, another inflection point that they need to move past, and that's what I'll talk about next. So once an organization is in this maturity phase, they inevitably reach this inflection point where they can't grow anymore because they've just become too mature, they've saturated a market. Now they need to look for new and creative ways to diversify their revenue stream or to change their business model to continue growth. And this is where they need new technologies, new processes, new ways of thinking, new organizational designs to help them get to that next level. So this is where you start to think about some of the more emerging modern technologies that will allow you to get out of this maturity phase and back to the growth phase. So this would be examples like predictive analytics, where you're better predicting and anticipating customer demand. Therefore, you're able to grow the business better than your other mature competitors. Another example might be e-commerce or customer experience type of software that provides a stickier, more common experience for your customers that makes them more likely to buy more goods or services from you. That could drive a certain amount of growth. So it's really thinking outside the box of sort of your mature back office ERP type of systems, now thinking about what are those technologies that can drive and fuel further growth and get us out of this sort of stable, mature phase and back into the growth phase. So I want to point out just a few caveats to this whole growth map I've pointed out here. First of all, if we're talking about going from $0 to $1 billion, this isn't going to be quite as linear and sequential as I've outlined here today. You might actually repeat some of these phases multiple times throughout the growth cycle. You might find that you're in a growth phase early on, you get some initial scale, you mature, but then you go back into a growth phase here that sort of starts you over again, and then you end up going through these cycles throughout your journey to $1 billion. The other thing I'll point out is that organizations spend different amounts of time and have different parameters for how they tap out or where they tap out or get stuck in the growth cycle. So for some organizations, they can get to $100 million just in this initial startup phase by using some real basic technologies and patching together some patchwork sorts of business processes. Others can only get to $5 million. So it really depends on your organization, the type of product, the scalability of your product or service in general, that's going to determine where you're at. The other thing I'll mention is there's a number of tools that can be used to get you past each of these inflection points or these ceilings or barriers that you need to get past. There's certainly technologies, which I've talked about throughout this video. But in addition to technology, you have to take a more comprehensive business transformation approach, a full digital transformation and business transformation approach. So in other words, as you move from one phase to another, what are the cultural differences and the way you need to bend your culture to support that phase that you're moving into? What is the organizational design? How are you going to organize work? What are roles and responsibilities? What are the change impacts and how are we going to move people to these new future state environments? That organizational design and the organizational change component is critical to scaling your organization. And then last but not least, your business processes. You can put in the best technologies in the world but still have broken business processes. So how can we ensure that we change our business processes and use technology to support those business processes to allow us to move past each of these phases and each of these points where we might get stuck along the way? So these are just a few things to consider as you think about how do we grow from a small startup or even a smaller mid-sized company to a larger multi-billion-dollar organization. These are some of the inflection points that most organizations face. And these are some of the things to think about as you go through your business or digital transformation to support these different inflection points. Now, for more information, I've included a number of links and resources below, including our annual digital transformation report that includes a number of best practices, software reviews, independent enterprise software rankings to help identify some of those technologies that might best help you move through these different phases in your growth cycle. I've also included a link to our organizational change management guide, which is meant to provide best practices on how to lead transformations and how to lead organizational change in your organization. And obviously that's going to be a critical component of scaling your organization. So I've included these two links as well as other resources, other links below. Be sure to check that out in the description field below. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.